Okay, so I'd like to introduce Michael Murdoch, who's an associate professor at the Munsell Color Lab at RIT, and he's going to talk about an AR, augmented reality topic. And I think this is a very interesting problem, especially with color. It's one thing with virtual reality where you have a full screen and have control over things, but with augmented reality, you have the world to worry about at the same time. And so I think it's a particularly difficult problem. Anyway, so Michael, please go ahead.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the whole AIC committee for the invitation to come and speak this week. I always really enjoyed AIC conferences because of the breadth of topics, so I appreciate being able to share the program with you all. Well, I have to say I'm a bit disappointed we're not meeting in person in Toronto, because I was really looking forward to making the trip and giving a presentation from a real stage to a real audience. But, you know, I think we can make the best of this Zoom implementation. In fact, one benefit is that I can give you this presentation from my lab, which is where I have some stuff that's a bit hard to bring on the road. So hopefully I can show you some things that would have actually been harder to bring to Toronto. What's this? Some kind of ghost?
That's right. Pepper's ghost.
Seems like some sort of optical trickery to me.
Indeed, indeed, optical trickery. Thank you. That's the theater portion of today's presentation. Wanted to bring you the experience of Pepper's ghost. As you probably gathered, and maybe you noticed during the introduction, that the video me here was just looping while I was sitting in the darkness next to it. But welcome to this talk. I want to talk about what I call color in layers. And I'm going to go from Pepper's ghost to augmented reality, and I'll try to tell you what Pepper's ghost is and show you what that means and the history of that, as well as some other related optical trickery that has come along through the years in a couple different sort of vision applications and in color science. And then I want to tell you why all that is fascinating for me as well, but then really connect everything to augmented reality, or AR, which is, as Brian mentioned, my primary research topic here at RIT. So let's start here with John Henry Pepper, 19th century Londoner, polymath, you know, one of these physicist, chemist, people who knows a little bit about everything, also dabbled in theater. And he has come to be known as the father, the creator of Pepper's ghost. But as you might imagine, he's not actually the guy who invented it. Some other guy named Henry Dirks, who you've never heard of, invented it. And I don't know whether Pepper stole it or bought it or whatever, but history remembers Pepper and Pepper's ghost from this era. So the era that I'm talking about is the 1860s, the era of phantasmagoria theater in Europe. Meanwhile, in North America, the US was fighting a civil war at this point, but in Europe, they were fascinated with the idea of ghosts and spirits, and creating theater shows that, you know, highlighted the paranormal and used things like literal smoke and mirrors and projected, you know, spotlights on actors or on clouds of smoke to make skeletons appear in the room and that kind of thing. And one of the tricks that was developed during this period was what we now call Pepper's ghost. Here's a diagram of what that can look like. So at the right here, you see the audience looking at actors on a stage, and you'll see one actor is dressed in black up here on the stage, and he is, you know, in real life standing on that real stage, and it looks like he's interacting with a ghost. Well, actually, that ghost is in the secret downstairs stage, which is not directly visible from the audience, but is visible in the reflection in this big sheet of glass that's right here in the middle of the theater. So this person dressed as a ghost is spotlit with a very bright light, much like I am spotlit with a very bright light here. And that spotlit ghost reflection is visible to the audience in this piece of glass. So realize that it's not projected onto the glass. It doesn't look like it's in the plane of the glass. It's like a mirror where it looks like it's behind the glass. And therefore the ghost and the other actor appear to be on the stage together, but they can do cool things like pass through one another because they're not actually in the same physical place. So if that diagram wasn't totally clear, here's another one. this is a top view showing what's happening, where at the bottom is the audience. And if they look straight ahead through this diagonal sheet of glass, this one is oriented a different way, but the same concept. This diagonal sheet of glass, behind which is the stage lit normally with lighting, where some of the actors are. And so they can see right through that piece of glass, those actors, but they can also see in the reflection of that glass, this sort of secret side stage where the ghost actor is. And when the spotlight is on that ghost, they appear in the reflection and are part of the play. But if the light goes out, the ghost vanishes, right? And the ghost can come and go throughout the play and that kind of thing, and can move around. So I'll show you some more examples of why light and shadow and darkness and things are really important. Oh, one thing I should have mentioned about the Phantasmagoria era, that was, as I understand it, one of the first times when theater was done in a dark theater, right? It used to be, before that, theater was presented in a fully lit room and the actors and the audience could all see each other clearly and everything. And it was kind of a novel thing to put the actors up on a dark stage and spotlight them and then create the interest and intrigue of dark regions and bright regions, which we all are familiar with now in modern theater and even cinema, right? So this is a picture of what I'm doing right now. And I mentioned this whole pile of mess would be hard to bring to Toronto. And I was, trying to scheme how I might do this before this conference was moved online. So as much as I do, hate yet another online conference, it did make it easy for me to do this and sort of, allow me to, enjoy sort of being Pepper's ghost for a presentation. So this is what it looks like. There's a lot going on there. The next picture shows kind of a more of a top view of what's happening. At the middle is this beam splitter, which is a piece of plexiglass. It's actually just a normal piece of plexiglass. It was in our classroom as like a COVID guard, from the days when we thought we could stop COVID with plexiglass. At the bottom right of this picture is a camera, and that camera sees me in the reflection of the plexiglass, but it also sees right through the plexiglass to a TV, which is essentially the second monitor in my computer setup here. So I don't have a stage, a secret side stage. I've just got a display there, which takes the place of that. And so what you see looking through that camera is an optical mix of what's behind the glass, the plexiglass, and what's reflected in the plexiglass. So if the TV is black, you just see me. If I turn off the lights, you see nothing. If I show an image on the TV and no light on me, you see that. By the way, this is one of the RIT provided Zoom backgrounds, one that I particularly like with this Joseph Albers painting that we have here on campus. If I turn my spotlight back on, maybe you can kind of see me here, but you notice that I'm very faint, right? And it's an optical addition. It's the added light of me in the spotlight with the background. So this is maybe a good reminder that this is nothing like the green screen or video matting that happens with a normal Zoom background, right? That one finds your head and shoulders, cuts you out, and pastes you as an opaque overlay on the background. And this is a weird sort of semi-transparent overlay that doesn't make any sense. So if I'm going to use a Zoom background in this setup, I'd be much better off using a black one, because that black one doesn't actually distort me in the image there. So, likewise, just to jump ahead to augmented reality, one application people have talked a lot about is telepresence. So if I wanted to put myself or my friend at a table like this as an augmented reality person or a Pepper's ghost, this is not a good way to do it because you can't see me. I would be better off turning the room around and putting myself on the dark part of the room, because then you see more of the virtual image and more contrast with that virtual image. Here's just another example of this. Like, there's this really strong connection between brightness and transparency, right? This white bar here makes me harder to see. It becomes very opaque. Likewise, if I have a bright object here in the real world, so my point was that, the brighter the object, right? This card is brighter than my face. And so it has an easier time overcoming the brightness of the other layer, right? So it's kind of like the layers add in light, and the brightest layer tends to dominate and overcome the other one. You can also do cool tricks like this, like, set myself on fire. This isn't quite a zoom background. This is, it almost looks like the fire is in front of me at this point. You can put yourself in a on fire zoom foreground. So Pepper's Ghost has been around a long time, and you might have heard of it, you might not have, but you may well have seen it, especially if you've been to Disney World. This is maybe the biggest and most well-known example of Pepper's Ghost in the Haunted Mansion. And if you've been on this ride, maybe you remember you're riding in this little car and you're kind of going sideways on this balcony, and you look down into this ballroom and you see all these ghosts dancing and spinning in there. And what you're actually looking at, you're looking down into a real physical room, but you're looking through a sheet of glass. And the reflection off that glass is actually looking below you, where these physical mannequins are dancing in spotlights, so that the beams, like a piece of glass, like a beam splitter, makes it look like those ghosts are in the other part of the room that you see directly through the glass. So this is a, again, very simple way to make a ghost. It's very physical, doesn't require any digital tricks or whatever else. It's completely optical. And it's been done at Disney World for 50 years or more, right? Another example, more recent one, more pop culture perhaps, the famous Coachella concert where Snoop Dogg shared the stage with Tupac Shakur, even though Tupac had been dead for 10 years or something like that. This was covered in the media as a hologram, which of course is a misnomer. This was just Pepper's Ghost, but the configuration was like this, where Snoop Dogg was actually on the stage, and there was a projector projecting an image of Tupac on a screen kind of on the floor, which then appeared reflected off this beam splitter towards the audience. In this case, they used a huge sheet of Mylar stretched really tight, which works just as well as plexiglass or regular glass for this kind of application. So getting back a little bit towards augmented reality, this is a marketing picture for Microsoft. They make the HoloLens, which is this sort of head-mounted thingy here. The idea of these displays is that you can see through the displays, you can still see the real world, but you can add stuff to it. You can augment the real world with other stuff. Note this is different than the other kind of AR, video-based AR, which you might have seen on your phone, things like Pokemon Go or like the IKEA furniture, configurator, where you can see things through the camera on your phone as if it was live in the real space. The head-mounted version is more transparent. It behaves more optically like this Pepper's Ghost thing. So this picture is a marketing image, but it shows you the idea that you could just put the Milky Way into your room and look at it kind of from all sides. And it's very compelling because it's like fixed in real world 3D coordinates, but it's also transparent, and you can see through that augmented reality presentation to the room behind you. And that introduces some of these complications about brightness and transparency that I'm talking about. This is a photograph through my Microsoft HoloLens. The astronaut floating there is the AR object, the virtual thing. And this is looking out my office window. Forgive me, there's this weird rectangle in here. That's not part of the AR. That's actually like a Fresnel lens against the glass. That's not part of the demonstration. It's just a distraction. But you can see this astronaut is floating there. It's white, so it tends to dominate. But you can see the white snow coming through it. You can tell that the astronaut is transparent because you see the snow through it. You see the dark building less obtrusively through the astronaut. But that transparency is always there with these sort of AR apparatuses. So this image I've used in several presentations to try to explain the concept of augmented reality. And it, again, comes back to Pepper's Ghost. And I show this to you to kind of point out that you've probably seen a scene like this very often, right? This one happens to be in Norway, which to me is kind of exotic and cool, but this is essentially any shop window in any city. And it's so unremarkable that it's bizarre that I'm talking about it maybe, but what you see through the glass are the mannequins, clothing on racks, clothing on shelves, no problem, it doesn't even catch your attention. But what you also see is the reflection of buildings that were behind me when I took this photograph, right? And if you look carefully in the foreground, like in the red skirt, you can see people like on the crosswalk kind of behind me in the street scene. So just like with Pepper's Ghost, you have this optical mix of what's behind the glass and what's reflected in the glass. And maybe it's because these sort of window scenarios are so common and so ubiquitous, you don't even notice. And you're able to clearly determine, clearly distinguish what's in the store and what's out in the street around you, right? And so even though these are optically blended, they all, meet your retina in the same place, you are able to separate those layers. There's a perceptual process called scission, which means you're able to split those layers and determine what belongs to which layer. There's also kind of a third layer in this one, which is the sticker on the window itself, which again, you can tell clearly that that's there. I took this picture in 2017 or so, but actually my interest in reflections in windows goes back a long ways, long enough into the past to the existence of the website Flickr. Flickr does still exist, but I don't know how well it's doing anymore. But around 2005, I was pretty active as an amateur photographer on this site. And I started this group called Inside Outside, which was basically for this kind of situation where you have kind of something through the glass and mixed with something reflected in the glass. And a bunch of other people joined in and shared some photos on this. And it became kind of a cool thing. And I think these photographs might be interesting, even though reflections in windows are super common. Most of the time they're they're moving, or they have some depth to them that gives you some more visual cue to the fact that they're reflections or not. But when you take a photograph, a moment in time from a single perspective with no stereopsis, you fuse those two layers, right? The foreground and the background are overlaid now forever. And that's where these pictures, that's why these pictures get interesting. That's why this photograph is worth discussing. And I think that also has implications for augmented reality. Like, we study a lot of things as if they're static, but in fact, as things move around, and as you understand the context better, you will be able to separate those layers, and the scission will be stronger. You'll be able to see what's happening. This is another example of a photo I took back in the day with this car that was behind glass and the lake behind me, and you can even see me as a silhouette in the layer there. And again, the sort of brightest part of either layer tends to dominate. The car dominates in the foreground, whereas the sky dominates in the background. All right, so some other weird optical trickery has caught my attention over the years. This is actually one of my favorite papers in psychophysical experiments from sort of visual psychophysics, from Sylvia Pont and others at the University in Delft in the Netherlands. This is a picture from their paper. It's a top view of their apparatus. The diagonal line is a glass beam splitter, and there are two model birds that are viewed through this hole, like from the front here. And the two birds are identical, and they're placed so that when you look at through them, you see one through the glass and one reflected in the glass, that so that they appear to be occupying the same space. So they look like one bird. So you'd say, okay, one bird plus another bird equals the same bird. No big deal, that's weird. But what they were studying was the material properties of the bird. So this is also from their paper, where they had a velvety bird. That's the left column goes from a velvety bird to a matte bird. The middle column goes from the top of a matte bird to a glossy bird, and the other is a velvet to a glossy bird. And they did that by putting one velvet bird and one glossy bird in their box, and then adjusting the relative amount of illumination on each of those, because you get the optical blend of those. So they're able to make these sort of optical blends of, gloss and matte and velvet. And we all have seen semi-gloss before, but like semi-velvet doesn't make any sense, right? A mix between velvet and gloss had not been seen before this experiment. But in fact, their experiment showed that people can interpret these very well, and they do kind of interpolate between known materials. Not necessarily linearly, but they do add them up in a logical way. Another cool old experiment came from Gilchrist and Jacobson, where they were looking at the idea of veiling luminance. This diagram, their figure 1, is exactly the Pepper's Ghost diagram I showed you a minute ago, right? At the bottom is an observer who's looking straight ahead through this diagonal piece of glass out the end of this tube to a scene. Part of their experiment was done with like an indoor box scene, and part of it actually looked out the window into a courtyard. And then reflected in this piece of glass was the light, with some kind of a light source with a diffuser. So not anything, not an actor, not an image on a screen or whatever else, but just like a flat wash of light. So you would see the real world through the piece of glass with a veil of luminance, veiling luminance, washed over it, just a kind of consistent addition of kind of gray or light to it. And they showed that you have no problem ignoring that veil of luminance and interpreting the scene behind. They were looking at lightness constancy. You have no trouble sort of interpreting the reflectance or lightness of objects behind that, even though there's this weird, light added to it. And this comes back again to augmented reality to help us understand what's happening there. So back to this, I showed you the HoloLens. Want to reinforce the point that these are all transparent displays. These are a variety of different headsets from over the years, from starting in the 1960s up till now. A lot of these, there are a lot of different optical configurations for these. The top left one here is most similar to Pepper's Ghost because it's kind of just the half mirror or beam splitter idea. You see other fancier optical implementations here that involve waveguides or freeform prisms or other things. But the point is that all of these allow you to see the real world through the optics, plus the image that the system is adding to it. Here at RIT, we've done a bunch of research with this apparatus and another one very similar to it, which is essentially, again, Pepper's Ghost, right? The diagram at the bottom left shows you this diagonal beam splitter that mixes something from the light booth in the background with something from a display. The picture on the right shows this, where the display is down below and these two kind of beige patches are reflected in the beam splitter. And the other colors you see here are in the background in a light booth that's illuminated with normal light. And so you see the overlay, again, the additive optical mix of those two. And with that apparatus, we've done a bunch of different experiments. We started with the idea of color matching, like how do people perceive these colors when they're mixed in this way? So here you see a couple of pairs. In both cases here, the two small patches are the same color on the AR screen, but you see like this one is distorted by this beige background, and so they don't match. And so in this experiment, we asked people to adjust the one on black in, say, lightness, chroma, and hue to match what they see of the other one that has a different background, right? And part of this has to do with simultaneous contrast, like what's the color surrounding it, and part of it has to do with the augmented reality blend, and part of it has to do with your interpretation of the situation and whether or not you're able to discount the background. And the short story of the results here was people don't make a physical match between these two colors, but they seem to ignore the background to some extent. They're able to discount the background to some extent. Similar experiment with, say, more complicated objects, 3D objects, because most AR presentations are meant to be 3D graphics kind of things. Similar results, I think. Another experiment we did had 3D objects in the background, in this case, cubes made of styrofoam and painted gray. And we were looking at lightness. It's actually really complicated to measure all 3 dimensions of color. So we simplified things to just look at lightness and thought, well, what happens if you add white in the AR overlay or some shade of gray to make that cube look brighter? And we did this in a bunch of configurations. And it turns out that if you have a sort of tightly fit and physically plausible overlay like these at the top, people make pretty close to a physical match. But if you have a big sloppy overlay like this or like this, then it behaves more like that veiling luminance paper from Gilchrist that says people ignore that layer, right? So somewhere you can either not ignore the layer at all or almost completely ignore the layer depending on the situation, which is kind of interesting. And then we wanted to model this and we said, okay, well, here's the physical situation. What you get is this physical optical blend. So in XYZ, or try stimulus space, but this just as well could be spectra or could be LMS cone signals or whatever you like. What's reaching your eye is the physical addition of what's coming from behind and what's coming from the front, so the foreground and the background. But we saw from these experiments that people don't actually behave like it's a physical match. They behave like they ignore one side or the other to some extent. So we changed that equation to include an alpha and a beta factor in there. So now you're saying, well, it's a bit of the foreground and a bit of the background, where if that bit, the alpha and the beta, were both equal to 1, that's the physical model. But in fact, alpha and beta both depend on the task you ask someone to do, the complexity of the stimulus, the luminance of the foreground and background, and the difference. And in general, alpha is greater than beta when you're looking at the foreground because you are able to ignore the background to some extent. And the opposite is true, where alpha is less than beta for background matching because you're able to ignore the foreground to some extent.
Michael, a 3-minute warning here.
All right, cool. So we did some other experiments to try to get at this, and it turns out that trying to predict these alphas and betas for a variety of situations is hard. This experiment shows the small pictures show the foreground, which has this little red AR patch, and the background, which is a bunch of Munsell patches and this black and gray panel behind. And what we asked the observers to do here was match that AR foreground to basically select the best of the Munsell patches, the best match among the Munsell patches to that small one. And again, finding a good model for how people think about alpha and beta was really difficult for all of these things. We also looked at transparency, and this image shows again that the brightness of the transparent layer tends to dominate and tends to correlate with opacity, which is frustrating in some cases. And we found out that luminance steps of equal luminance we know are not perceptually uniform. Steps of equal brightness are uniform in brightness, and we were able to create uniform steps of transparency in this case. Now this is kind of related to this old illusion. This is an optical illusion, right? There's nothing physically transparent here, but it looks transparent to you because of the way these figures are drawn. I can show you, this is similar to in my world here. I will show you this card. Here I have just a piece of orange paper on black, and I can show you that something kind of similar here happens, but it's a little different. The figure on your right seems to be modeling some sort of subtractive transparency, but what I'm holding in my hand, again, is this physically additive transparency, which behaves a little bit differently. But you still have the perceptive transparency. You kind of understand what's happening. This, again, relates to simultaneous contrast. A figure like this, I'm sure you've seen many times before, where the two oranges are actually the same physical color, but they look different to you because of the background effect. This one is a little bit more unusual. The same three colors there of yellow, red, and orange, but now the orange circles look completely different because of the assimilation there. And again, you could try to interpret this like transparency, right? There's something weird happening here with layers and bars happening across here. So what can I try to conclude from this? The first thing, basically, AR, augmented reality, is essentially Pepper's Ghost, right? So it's much like windows and transparency and reflections, presenting optical blends of foreground and background. And again, on the one hand, that is totally normal and something that we see all the time, every day. But on the other hand, it's weird and unusual. We have things like Pepper's Ghost that look strange and surprise you. And I think the reason for that is because visual discounting, meaning your ability to scission the layers and focus on one layer or the other, depends on many things. It depends on luminance, it depends on context, it depends on motion, it depends on your experience and your sort of level of understanding of the situation. We've had people in these AR experiments sort of change their criteria for matching and other things over the course of experiments or between experiments as they gain experience using the system. So an AR color appearance model, which is one of our goals here, is difficult to get to because it has to account for transparency and context in a way that existing color appearance models have never had to do. So our current color appearance models tend to fall short, and because they're missing parameters that we need to uncover here for augmented reality. So I do want to show you one last thing just to amuse you a little bit. This is one of these images that came across the internet. I don't know if any of you saw it, but hopefully after seeing this presentation, what you're looking at here makes perfect sense. I have to tell you that the title of this Reddit post was perfect, spot on, right? Schrodinger's cat. Is the cat in the box or not? I don't know. Everybody always appreciates a quantum physics joke, but hopefully you clearly see here that the cat was outside the glass door and the box was inside the glass door, and it's only in this Pepper's Ghost arrangement here that it appears to be sort of partly in the box like this. So with that, we come to the end. I just wanted to show you the growing list of students who've contributed their knowledge and their work to do all this work that we're doing, and also to acknowledge funding from the National Science Foundation, as well as academic gifts from Microsoft and Meta that we've been able to work with. So thank you all for the opportunity to speak today, and appreciate the chance to talk about it more.
I'm muted now. We had this little, everybody held I couldn't talk to you. Anyway, great talk. Thank you. Really enjoyed it. So we have some time for questions. And if people would like to raise their hand or put a question in the chat, that would be great. And I need to get on the participants to see it all. But if has anybody raised their hand yet, that's the confusion. What is, Charles, you had, oh, that was a clap, not a hand raise? Okay, yes. What is, as a joke, sort of, what's the precision of scission? Like, do we do that really well or just sort of?
I'd say from 0 to 1, from not at all to completely. It's quite amazing, especially in the one that I showed you a bunch of cubes there. When people are assessing transparency in that experiment by Lily Zhang, people were able to discount the background like 100%. It was pretty amazing. So, and I think you do that all the time. You know, if you're driving and you have reflections in your car window or something like that, you're able to completely ignore those. You're never confusing those reflections with something that's actually out in the world in front of you.
Other people with questions? Are other people able to? Oh, Anya.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. If you're really there, I'm not actually sure whether you're real or not, but that was really wonderful. That was fantastic. Do you think from these experiments you will be able to, explain better, why we see like subtractive transparency under some conditions and additive transparency under others? I mean, ultimately, will you be able to, from your measurements and the different perceptual effects you get under different conditions, derive a model that then predicts if you have this arrangement of luminances and this arrangement of chromaticities, you will see additive transparency? Or is it all going to sort of just remain magic?
That's an awesome question. I don't really know. I got into this work with sort of, I didn't foresee this in 2005 when I was taking pictures of reflections in glass, but it turned out that I was quite fascinated with this with all these AR questions. And when I got started, I thought, well, we'll figure out how to modify these color appearance models to account for this, and it's probably just an add-on, right? And we talked about, well, you could tweak the input. You could think of like the cone or the XYZ inputs to a color appearance model and modifying those to account for something that's happening. Or you could calculate some appearance correlates and then modify those later to account for whatever weirdness is happening in AR. And maybe I need to add a new dimension like transparency, like you're talking about there. And that all seemed kind of like doable. And now a few years into it, I'm afraid that it's a bigger problem than I was expecting. So we unfortunately don't have even that color appearance model that I was hoping for. But I do think we will get pieces of it, certainly, right? So Lily, who just finished here recently, her PhD here, was able to derive brightness and transparency scales based on the kind of contrasts and contrast ratios of what's happening in the background and what's in the foreground, which I think gets closer to what you're asking about. The cognitive distinction between additive and subtractive is a good question. Basically, everything I'm studying here is additive kind of by nature because it's all these AR systems, this Pepper's Ghost kind of situation. So I'm not really trying to make that distinction. But I think, broadly speaking, I'd love to have, from these particular cone inputs, what are all the things that we understand, right? Which is vision science, all of vision science. But for the AR situation, I'm optimistic that we can get to useful scales, right? In the same way that we have appearance scales for color and other things like that.
So, thank you. Anybody else? I've got another question myself, but what I was wondering is, are you aware of any technology that managed to black out the thing you're overlaying?
That's a really good question. I'm aware of one or two academic papers. There's a woman, Hong Hua in Arizona, optics professor, who has designed an AR optical system that does allow an addressable opacity layer. But this device is already pretty big and heavy and thick. And her design involved basically a folded telescope where the light coming in went up and through, was focused on basically a DMD device in order to modulate the light that went through further. So you imagine like taking this and adding like a superstructure on it in order to do that opacifying thing. So she demonstrated that it's possible, but it's really not practical, right? And I don't think there's any hope of fitting that into a head-mounted device that is what people really want. In fact, this HoloLens has not really succeeded as a real product, in part because it's already too bulky, right? People want eyeglasses. That's the solution that people really need. So I think optically, unless somebody invents something really new, that's going to be really hard. The alternative, though, is video-based, right? All of the problems with this transparency are because this display is physically transparent. If you took a VR display, which blocks out the real world, and you put two cameras on the front of it looking out at the real world, you can have a live view through those cameras, and you can do video compositing, alpha matting perfectly, right? The problem there, though, is that then you have to look at the real world through cameras, which has lag, which then gives you seasickness, right? And it has just the little difference in perspective of having the cameras out physically separated from where your eyes are, gives you weird perspective changes and that kind of thing, even if you match the field of view of the displays. So there are some people in the AR world who think video-based AR is the better solution, because then you can avoid all this transparency, right? And maybe they can solve the lag and other problems to make that palatable. You could probably account for that perspective difference by like re-rendering things with a virtual camera or something, but that's kind of the tension right now between optical-based and camera-based AR, and I don't know which one will win in the future.
Okay, we're essentially out of time. David Briggs says to everyone, often what is called transparency is what I'd call translucency, the appearance of a scattering film. Would it be worth making this distinction?
Yeah, that's a good point. Some people really have a firm distinction between those words. I don't think that's universal. So that would actually be an interesting study to see how people describe these things. But transparency with some level of density versus scattering with some amount of, say, image blurring or contrast loss or those kind of things. Those are all related. Typically, the transparency that we're talking about here is just it's clear in terms of it doesn't actually distort the image, but it's lowering the luminance of things, right, in a uniform way, like a neutral density filter. Okay, great. Well, I think we need to stop there. Thank you very much. It was great talk, great performance, which we normally don't get as part of a talk. Now